Welcome to this video, which is an interview on the 50th anniversary of what has become known as Bloody Sunday, when on Sunday the 30th of January 1972, British troops shot at demonstrators, people peacefully marching in Derry in Northern Ireland, and 14 people were killed. And the reverberations of that event still carry on through the whole of the experience of workers in Northern Ireland ever since. And tonight, I'm pleased to say we've got two socialist activists who've been campaigning in the movement in Northern Ireland for a very long time. They were young children or teenagers at the time of Bloody Sunday, and they're going to talk about the history of that event. So I welcome Harry Hutchison and Mick Craig with me to speak. And maybe, Harry, I could start with yourself, and if you could give us an outline of what actually happened on the day.
Yeah, well, there were many atrocities over the history of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Bloody Sunday stands out, I think, more than anyone of the events. What happened on the 30th of January 1972 was the most blatant and indiscriminate murder of ordinary people on the streets. And it's when you look at some of the killings, you just see the gravity of the brutality that happened that day. Many of the people were shot by army, some of them at close range, some of them at point blank range. Many were shot in the back, who were running away, effectively away from the ensuing paratroopers that were moving into the area. At least two people were shot trying to give aid to one of the victims lying on the ground. They were just shot in the most indiscriminate form imaginable. There were, in fact, 27 people shot on the day. 13 died on the day, one was to die later. But the rest of them, it just shows just the extent of the atrocity when they opened up and shot as many as 27 in total. According to the report, there were over 100 rounds of ammunition fired by the paratroopers on that particular day. As far as any psychological effects, they've remained to this very day. The victims of the family victims to this day still live in the horror of what happened that day. It's worth bearing in mind, because I do believe these two events are important and they do come together, because it was 5 months earlier than Bloody Sunday that in Ballymurphy, the same paratroop regiment moved in to an area in West Belfast and effectively carried out as bad, in fact, possibly even worse than actually Bloody Sunday. They shot 11 people in the same manner as the people were killed on Bloody Sunday itself. And not only that, there was the army carried out a number of arrests, interrogation, and the most brutal methods possible of abuse that took place on the day on Ballymurphy itself 5 months earlier. Torture, and the torture, it was one of the most brutal I think you would ever see. It was the beginning of what was known as things like waterboarding, beatings, standing in long positions for a very, very long time, and in fact even bringing people up in helicopters, alluding to the fact that the helicopters were up in the air and actually being pushed out of a helicopter, but the helicopter was on the ground. So a psychological torture happened in Ballymurphy. Now, that was repeated, as I say, in Bloody Sunday, on January 30th. And it shows the extent, I think, and the attitude of how Britain at that time had a strategy for the people of Northern Ireland. We can talk that later, but that brutality, I think, is one that stands out in all of the history of the Troubles that we have today and to this very day.
Thanks, Harry. And maybe I could go to you, Mick, and talk about what effect the events of that day had on people like yourself and people you knew, the communities generally in Northern Ireland.
Well, in January 1972, I was almost 16 years old, and so I was already a worker. I had workmates from both sides of the community. I had gone to a school which was mixed, which was unusual in Northern Ireland, and so I had friends from both sides of the community. My parents would have been sympathetic, who were atheists, would have been sympathetic to the civil rights cause because they were on the left. And even though I didn't know much about politics, I was influenced by them. I saw Northern Ireland when I was a kid as being a sort of normal society. Some revisionists would try and tell us that it was an apartheid state. It was nothing of the kind. You know, for a start, Catholics were not considered to be undermentioned or anything like that. What did happen was that they weren't trusted because after partition, a great minority of the population were Catholics who had been sort of corralled into the new Northern Ireland state, many against their wishes. And so the laws that were there were normal laws, with the exception of the Special Powers Act, which was based on the fact that well, a lot of these people don't want to be here, so they could make trouble. So we need to be able to suspend habeas corpus in order to deal with anybody who is a threat to this new state. And so and it was the same law that was used to bring about internment in 1971. And that was, you know, the first big example of it being used. I don't think it was used all that much. But as far as apartheid went, there was in Derry city itself discrimination in housing and jobs, and the place had been gerrymandered so that nobody could get a council seat except if they were a unionist, and it was to keep unionism there in perpetuity. But overall, you know, it was a normal capitalist society where the workers had very little rights. It didn't matter what your background or what your allegiance, you know, constitutional allegiance was. There was, you know, even in 1972, vast swathes of housing that had no inside toilets and no baths and all this. You know, it was way behind anywhere in Britain. But people had generally a sort of deference towards the government, and not just Protestant workers, but a lot of Catholic workers had a deference to the government and just thought, well, this is normal. But in areas like Derry and Dungannon, where there was blatant housing discrimination, that's where things kicked off. And of course, there always had been some very small attacks on the state by the original IRA, right since partition up until up until 62, when in fact they were completely defeated, and whatever was left went underground. Ian Paisley, of course, wasn't happy with that, and he thought that unionism was moving towards a sort of opening up and allowing the Republic of Ireland's government to have some say here, because there had been some meetings between the Prime Minister Terence O'Neill and the Taoiseach in the south. And so he stirred this all up, that this was going to be the end of Northern Ireland, the end of Ulster, as he called it. And that's when sectarianism sort of took off, and you had sectarian attacks. But it has to be said that Northern Ireland was actually quite a law-abiding place. I mean, we had very low crime here compared with the rest of Britain. And that in itself says something. Anybody that got into trouble then did it for political reasons. Well, the state decided, that this threat had become real by 1969, whenever the IRA had resurrected itself and split into two factions and started to make war against the soldiers and the police. And they were determined that this was a threat to the state, and they would use any power necessary to bring it down. And that's when Ballymurphy happened. I mean, they had put up with people having illegal marches and all, which had, Burntollet was pretty rough, but it wasn't sanctioned by the British government. It was the local government. And internment, of course, was at the behest of the Northern Ireland Prime Minister, Faulkner. But because he was able to convince them that this was a threat to the state itself, they basically let him do what he liked. And that's how you got the paratroopers in position, doing what Harris described in August in 71 in Ballymurphy. And that's how because they got away with that, you then had a repeat of it on Bloody Sunday in January. But, there was two things happened after that. And it was, a lot of Catholics who had sort of knuckled down and decided that they were going to be part of Northern Ireland, changed their minds and thought, well, we don't want to be part of this. If they can shoot us down, if our own government can shoot its own citizens down in the street because we dare to protest, we can't be part of this. But the other thing was that there were many Protestants who were sympathetic to civil rights and went to civil rights marches and all the rest of it. And because even people on the left had a deference towards authority, it's just part of the makeup of people here. They believed the propaganda, they believed the Widgery Tribunal, which was a complete whitewash, and they distanced themselves from it, and that was the big division. Now, the government they wanted to have division because it was in their interest to divide the workers, but they didn't want the bloodbath that had come about. And so that's why they decided that they were going to crack down on it, and that had the effect that people who were sympathetic and could have done something to help the civil rights issue were too scared. And first of all, they didn't believe it. I mean, I had trouble believing as a 16-year-old that the army shot these people in cold blood. There must have been a gunman there, that even people like me and my family thought that there must be some truth in this. They couldn't possibly just do this, And that has had a long-lasting effect. It has taken years for reasonable people to accept that those people that were killed were innocent.
Thanks, Mick. So you've given us a good insight there into the issues that existed at the time, the class issues and the civil rights issues. Harry, is there anything you'd like to add about why you think the events took place, what led to them, basically why did it kick off the way it did?
Yeah, maybe just before I answer the why happened, it was clear before Bloody Sunday and indeed Ballymurphy that Britain was planning a strategy to intervene in Northern Ireland, and that was going to be a ruthless military strategy of repression. I mean, when you look at this 1st Battalion of the Parachute Regiment, this was no ordinary regiment. It was, in fact, a special regiment within a regiment. And the people that were chosen for the 1st Battalion were themselves earmarked overseas. And they were identified as people who were quite ruthless in their military engagement in overseas territories. And soldiers who were seen who would possibly go beyond, if you want, the normal rules of engagement. And these were the people that were chosen for this particular parachute regiment. The commander himself of the regiment, Lieutenant Colonel Derek Wilford, was himself regarded certainly as a very ruthless colonel. And he was the one that was certainly, in my opinion anyway, was put into the position to lead this regiment that was sent to Northern Ireland, that carried out both atrocities in Bloody Sunday and the one previously in Ballymurphy. And incidentally, even months after Bloody Sunday, it was the same regiment that went in fact, to a loyalist area, to the loyalist paramilitary UDA, Ulster Defence Association headquarters, raided it, and in September of 1972, shot 2 civilians dead in what was a loyalist area, which incidentally carried a standoff from the British force known as the Ulster Defence Regiment here, a regiment in the British Army itself, and they themselves refused to carry out any duty until the paratroopers left, which was effectively the Shankill area in Belfast. To me, that shows that there was a strategy planned here for Northern Ireland and the situation. Now, undoubtedly, the main event was internment. And internment was used very ruthlessly. It was certainly at the early stages, not exclusively, by the way, throughout the whole of the Troubles, but internment was used against the Catholic population. And that was, as I was saying earlier, to arrest people, to bring them in, interrogate them, torture them, and so on. And you must remember that on the day of Bloody Sunday itself, the march was predominantly against internment. It was a massive march of 20,000 people that had rallied to Derry on that day. There were some other marches, incidentally, against internment that actually was something like twice that amount. But it just shows the extent of the feeling throughout the country, particularly in regard to internment, which was a ruthless British policy that fueled and angered particularly Catholic populations, but I think you would also include many Protestants as well. It was a real attack on civil liberties. So that was certainly the biggest issue on the day. But what you've got to really do is to go back to the events that took place in the late 60s, and that was the rise of the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association. And that was it was the beginning of the end of any unionist dominated rule in Ireland since in the Northern Ireland since partition. There was indeed some favourable, if you want, social policies that were regarded towards the Protestant population, but effectively the whole population suffered. But the Civil Rights Association was a huge uprising, and certainly by the early 70s was growing massively. Predominantly earmarked certainly in areas of Derry. The reason I believe Ballymurphy happened was because Ballymurphy would have been one of perhaps the next major area that also would have risen up and joined the events that was taking place in Derry itself. So they moved in, although on this occasion, very early on to crush Ballymurphy, and then later on, as we know, in Bloody Sunday itself. But when you look at the people that were killed, were ordinary people, protesters. They weren't members of the IRA. In fact, both the Widgery and, by the way, the Savile inquiry both concluded that none of them were in any way involved in any paramilitary organization. They were ordinary people out protesting for their civil rights. And of course, by 1972, they had made quite a number of advancements, the civil rights movement, the right to vote, and their demands for equal and shared housing, for equal and shared jobs, and in itself, which was a great victory for everybody, and that was to bring down this unionist government, the very Tory in outlook, discriminatory in outlook. And, so from that point of view, they were going from strength to strength. What would have happened preceding Bloody Sunday is an open question. I certainly would be very disappointed in the involvement or the lack of involvement from the trade union movement here in Ireland. It was a golden opportunity for the trade unions to become involve themselves and unite the people and on program to move forward. But as far as Britain was concerned, and to be honest with you, I'm quite clear, they were not after paramilitaries, Republican paramilitaries. The targets were people. The targets were the protesters, and the targets was to crush the uprising of the people in Northern Ireland that began in the late 60s. As far as Britain was concerned, that could spiral, expand, and go way beyond the borders, perhaps of Northern Ireland, perhaps even into the Britain itself. It was important for Britain to crush that movement, and that's exactly what they did in Bloody Sunday. What happened after Bloody Sunday, it did end the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association movement. It crushed the movement. And what we saw after that was, well, effectively, as one comment said, if anybody wasn't going to join the IRA, there was no one left. They joined the paramilitary organizations, the IRA, after that. And that really began and swelled the ranks of the IRA after that. In a sense, you could argue, maybe it's an overstatement, Britain made the IRA. It was Britain that really swelled their ranks after the atrocity of Bloody Sunday. And very sadly for the people of Northern Ireland, it was the end of the civil rights movement. It was crushed in exactly the same brutality. You could address it to Sharpeville massacre, many other regimes throughout the world. It was crushed in Tiananmen Square. You could countless other examples. This was Northern Ireland's crushing of the movement of the people in what was a revolutionary situation in Ireland at that time.
Thanks very much, Harry. The Bloody Sunday's been there's been a demonstration every year since 50 years, but this weekend, in the 50th anniversary, we'll have no doubt a really big demonstration. So bringing it forward like 50 years, what's the significance of this particular demonstration 50 years on? What sort of issues is that demonstration going to raise about Bloody Sunday?
Well, first of all, both of us will be there on Sunday at the 50th anniversary march. The thing is that the state hasn't been held responsible for what happened, and they are responsible, and that's why the protest is still going on. you know, there was 200 million quid spent on a big inquiry and a report, but the report, you know, basically singled out one soldier to be prosecuted. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. The people who Harry named earlier in the discussion are those responsible, and the Prime Minister at the time was responsible, and the whole British state was responsible, and they haven't been held to account, and the protests will go on until they are held to account, and that's why we're still having this 50 years later.
Thanks, Mick. Would you like to add anything to that, Harry?
Yeah, I think it's, Mike has mentioned the main one there, and the main one is justice. I mean, this weekend, there's always been a commemoration for the people who died on that day and the people who injured. And it's always, I think, a time of year, you know, for many people, there's meetings today. There was a meeting today, for example, with the veteran socialist Eamon McCann and the former Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn. And they had a meeting today, and there was many of the relatives of the victims were at that meeting. It's always an opportunity to, you know, maybe for the victims to get their emotions out and their remembrance of what actually happened on that day. There is you know, still huge scars left 50 years on from this. The main area, another of the main areas, of course, justice. Now, the Savile inquiry, which exonerated any of the victims here, put at least blame on the soldiers that they were, I think it was used very mild terminology that was used in the report were a bit overhanded. It was an atrocity, but there hasn't been any justice. There's been an apology I think it was 2014 by David Cameron, who was forced to make an apology on the day. Well, apology is one thing, justice is another. And I mean, from the very day on January 30th, the British were covering up what they did on that day. And when the reports were given to Michael Jackson, who was the adjudicate commander there on Bloody Sunday, the reports from the soldiers were nothing but effectively, well, it was not related to the events at all. They claimed that they were being shot at and so on. And there was even an attempt on the day of one victim who was on his way to hospital, driven by members of the public, where the army intervened. They effectively took the injured person. He died on the scene before he got to the hospital, and they stuffed his pockets with effectively nail bombs. Just an attempt to throw off the scent, if you want, of what they did in that day, trying to blame a victim that there was terrorism taking place on that day. It's just another example of how they managed to cover up what they did. But there's been no justice. And as Mike mentioned, Soldier F, for example, just one of the people mentioned, he was a particularly trigger happy individual on that day, and you know, chosen for exactly that role. It was alleged that he had shot 2 people, but according to the Savile inquiry, he was actually responsible for 3 other killings that took place on that day. His name is out in the public domain, and it was mentioned, so we actually know who he is. I thought I'd had his name here, but I can't just seem to find it here at the moment. But it demonstrates that the British do know, I think, a great deal who fired on the day, who killed on the day. And as Eamon McCann made the point, after the Savile inquiry, the commanding officers were being let off. And you're talking about Colonel Derek Wilford. You're talking about Michael Jackson on the day, and he was there in Ballymurphy as well as a press officer, give a pack of lies to the press that went all over the world, and people were just effectively, given the one-sided events that happened that day. We haven't had justice. And as time's going on, you have to say, are we going to see justice? Well, time, unfortunately, is not going to be on our side, whether actually we're going to get that justice. But I think this is the march. And it's now 50 years later, as we've seen from the rest of the troubles in Northern Ireland. We could mention countless other atrocities, not just by state, but by paramilitary organizations, where we have not seen justice being carried out. And there is a reason for that. And the reason for that is for Britain to really go to courts and bring these people to justice. The real truth of Britain's role in Northern Ireland, particularly involvement through the controlling MI5, would come out. Britain's involvement in their infiltration of paramilitary organizations, directing operations from the paramilitary organizations, but also directing operations from the state itself in killings, not just in the 1971 and 72, but throughout the Troubles. They were directing operations. And for justice, or even any element of justice to happen, the truth would have to come out from the courts, and the role of Britain would come out. That is why we have never seen justice. And as far as Bloody Sunday is concerned, it is also an indication to the soldiers. Look, this is what happened. You're not going to be blamed. You're not going to go to court. You did what effectively you were instructed to do on the day, and we might need you for another day. So effectively what you did there, nothing's going to happen. You're safe wherever you are. So it could happen again. It could very well happen again if events were to turn and people were becoming united in the north of Ireland, back to the streets again. Of course, the same thing could happen again, just like it did 50 years earlier.
Thanks, Harry. You explained very well how important this particular commemoration is, and every year until justice is seen to be done. So, Mick, is there anything you'd like to say about how the events, how conditions are generally for working people in Northern Ireland, sort of going back through the whole 50-year period before and since Bloody Sunday? So, if there's anything you'd like me to say about that?
Well, besides all the war, things here were just as normal as they were in Britain or anywhere else. There has been some differences for workers here, like our pay is lower and our bills are higher, and they've always been like that. One of the things that sort of normalized this place before the Troubles was the welfare state that was introduced against the wish of the Unionists in 1948, it has to be said. But they could see, once they had it, that it evened things up a bit. And that's where you got a lot of Catholics deciding that, we'll just get our heads down and we'll be part of the society, But as I explained, there were devious people didn't want to have it that way. And so they created bogeymen and started the whole thing up again. So things here at the minute are pretty dire because of the protocol and Brexit and all the rest. The unemployment isn't high, but what's the point of working if you can't live on a wage, and wages are lower here than they are anywhere else. So we had after 1972 the housing executive, which took over all council houses and allocated houses on the basis of need rather than what religion you were. And although it has to be said that that wasn't There was not blanket discrimination in housing in all of Northern Ireland. It was in little pockets. It was more corruption and could be sectarian or not. It was corruption that a councillor could get you a house if you were his mate, But of course, revisionists will tell you, no, it was all sectarian. There was all, if you weren't a Catholic, you couldn't get a house. Not true. There was houses built in Newry and Belfast, equally as good, equally the same quality and the same numbers as required, and on both sides of the community in the 1950s and 60s. Now, of course, we're in worse conditions because most of those houses have been sold off. The housing executive, which had a stock of, I think, 750,000 houses at one time, has now got 28,000 houses in Northern Ireland. I mean, that's a serious problem. So social conditions here are not good at all. Nothing has changed, really.
Thanks, Mick, for that. So, is there anything else that you'd like to add? Anything else on this occasion that we should talk about? Harry, start with yourself.
Yeah, well, just maybe to follow just a wee bit from what Mike was saying, there is, a degree of normality, probably a large degree of normality here today. I mean, we don't have army troops on the ground. There is no British army here now since the 1970s, right up to, effectively the Good Friday Agreement 20 odd years ago. So there isn't the same violence from the paramilitary organizations. They do exist, the paramilitaries. They exist in the communities. They control communities, and the whole thing's evolved through, drug addiction, alcohol addiction, extortion, and there's punishment, beatings goes on, pretty some horrendous beatings that have led to death by organizations. So as far as that concerns, things have very greatly changed from what's happening on, from in the 70s to say right through to the troubled era. I mean, what we have today is a very much divided people, and it remains divided. And that's deliberately done so. It's the British do it, and as well as the main political parties do it. They never miss an opportunity to keep as people as divided as possible. It's largely done through the electoral ballot box in the way the political parties do this. But it's important for the British strategy to keep the people here divided, because that's how they'll control people. And after saying that, there's still very much evidence, particularly on issues and LGBT rights and the strikes that are going on for better employment strikes, that is bringing people closer and closer together. So I think there's an underlying trend there that we don't see very well, because a lot of it's done through ballot boxes and political parties and so on. There is a great trend, in my opinion, that for people uniting and coming together and taking up the issues that everybody's involved in. Going back to this weekend, it's a full weekend of commemorations, and very sadly, we're about to be hit by a hurricane later on tonight, which is going to really drown out things tomorrow. Jeremy Corbyn is speaking at the Guildhall, giving a lecture on the events 50 years ago. And then on Sunday, there's the Commemorative March for the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. It's going to be a long march, and I expect that, with goodness gracious, thousands and thousands will be turned out for that event there itself. It's a commemoration. It's a remembrance for the people that have died. It's a day for the families of the victims, and it's a day to bring the people together and commemorate that the atrocity that took place, that really was a turning point for everyone in the history of the troubles that we had here. So I just hope the weather isn't going to cut across it too badly. We're about, as I say, a major storm. So it's another weekend, but remember, the struggle for justice will go on and on and on. that struggle for justice. We might not see it under this ruthless capitalism. It might need a transformation of society before we actually see it. But I think that is what's keeping the whole thing going, as well as the commemorations.
Well, thanks very much. That's been excellent. Really, thank you for your contributions, and enjoy the events of the weekend. And also, I wish you good luck in. I know you both are fighting, continue to fight for workers' unity and against the divide and rule tactics of the British state. And I wish you good luck in the struggle that you're involved in Northern Ireland. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.